We are invited in this text to notice the differences between Jesus, the king, and another king. He's mentioned by name. That's how we know we're invited to consider the differences. Perhaps you already have thought of that name in those days. Caesar Augustus, Roman emperor, king of everything you can see and most of what you can't. The sort of guy who lives in a palace, who is attended by security and servants, who gives commands, issues decrees, and people who live hundreds of miles away and have never seen him face to face pack their things and travel to another town. He has power, he has authority, he has force. And everything that happens in Luke 2 happens against the backdrop of his reign. And so it's helpful to know a little bit about his reign and the way he saw himself and the way his subjects saw him. This is where you can be thankful for archaeologists. You probably don't wake up every morning going, man, I'm really thankful for archaeologists. But you should, at least sometimes, at least today. The archaeologists are always digging up ruins from the old Roman Empire and trying to find out more and discover some of the history. And one of the things that they dig up with some frequency, we actually have quite a lot of these, are inscriptions. They're often in Latin, sometimes Greek, but we have tons of inscriptions from the Roman Empire. Some of them are pretty mundane. It's the equivalent of somebody's shopping list that they carved into a little bit of stone. Some of them are rather more important. And one of the particularly important ones comes in the form of, well, this is what it's called. It's called, wait for it, the Priene Calendar Inscription. Now that sounds like an archaeologist probably made the name up, doesn't it? It's got academic all over it. You can Google it later if you want to. It's Priene. I see somebody writing that down. I'm so encouraged right now. Rick, let me know what you find out. The Priene Calendar Inscription. Now, Augustus was the kind of guy who liked other people to know how awesome he was. And before he died, he wrote down just a catalog of his accomplishments. You can read that too. It's out there. And one of the ways that an emperor, a Caesar, would make sure everybody knew how awesome they were is they'd have inscriptions set up all over the place. So here's the Priene Calendar Inscription, and it's about a paragraph long, originally written in Greek, but there are translations on Wikipedia that you can look up if you want to. And if you read them, you'll discover what will be to us some surprising language. You'll discover that a lot of the words we find in the Bible about Jesus were used by the emperor of himself before Jesus was born. This inscription dates to about 9 years before Christ. If you start reading it later on after you Google it, you'll find that it praises the goddess Providence. Because after all, she's the one who gave us Augustus as a savior. Now that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Well, we just read Luke chapter 2, verse 11, where the angelic host declare to the shepherds, surprised as they were, that in the town of David a Savior has been born. We are invited to read these two along the side of each other, Jesus and Augustus. It's not the only overlap. Later on, the day of Augustus's birth, however many years before that was, is declared to be a day marked by a gospel. You could translate it that way. It's the Greek word euangelion, which is where we get the word evangelism, which also comes from the word evangel, which is just the Greek word for gospel. Glad tidings, good news, gospel. Augustus, his birthday was the beginning of the glad tidings. That's what the inscription says. His birthday was the beginning of the Roman gospel. That's literally what the inscription says. And yet the angels come and they tell us, we bring you, in Luke chapter 2, verse 10, glad tidings. The Greek word is the same word in the inscription. Gospel. Good news. Before the inscription ends, Augustus is literally called a god. This was convenient for Roman emperors. If you want to solidify your power, deify yourself. Tremendously helpful as far as strategies go. And if you were the son of an emperor and your father didn't deify himself, well, you could deify him post-mortem, and that made you what? Son of a god. Pretty typical standard operating procedure for these dynasties. So we have language about Jesus, and we have Luke tell us this is during the reign of Augustus. And the archaeologists have dug up stuff that tells us what he thought about himself and how other people thought about him. And it's the same kind of language. Gospel, Savior, God. And yet, their realities couldn't be more different, could they? I mean, imagine a child of Augustus being placed in a feeding trough after he was born. No, any child of any emperor is going to have the finest crib and countless nursemaids and attendants and proper nutrition and robes and garments. And I honestly don't know what they wrap emperors' children in when they're born, but you can imagine it's probably pretty fancy. All the stuff for this brand new baby. But then you get Jesus, whose parents aren't even at home. They've been traveling. And they're looking for a place to stay. They're looking for a guest room in the family house. You may have noticed the translation. Let's do this real quick. Luke chapter 2, verse 7. You're reading along, and you might have been thinking, what Bible's he preaching out of? Because that's not how my Bible reads. But unless you have the 2011 New International Version, then it is. But different translations run this different ways. And it's not quite how the nativity plays go. Sorry to whoever's playing the innkeeper next week. She gave birth to her firstborn, a son, and she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room in the... That's what I read. What does it normally say? Inn. Well, which one is it? Somebody's guest room or an inn? And if you've been around before, you've heard some of this, but we'll rehearse it a little bit. The word that is translated by the NIV, rightly so, is guest room. It shows up one more time in Luke's gospel. It's the room where Jesus and his disciples had the Last Supper, the upper room. Unless we think they had their Last Supper in an inn, that's probably not the right translation, because Luke only uses it twice and there's no signal that he means anything different. How does this work? Well, the kataluma is a room that most Jewish houses in the first century are going to have. If you've got a one-story unit, it's on the ground floor. It's the room where your family stays when they come to visit for the census. It's the guest room. That's what it's called. You got the family room, you got the guest room, the kataluma. If you're in a one-story unit, the animals stay out back. There's kind of some space back there, and they're fenced in, and you keep them back there. Sometimes you had two-story houses, and the animals stayed on the ground floor. There was a little rickety wooden ladder, probably rickety in a lot of instances. You climb up that to get to the top level, and at the top level you had the family room and the guest room, the kataluma. So when Luke tells us there was no room for them in the guest room, he's not bashing the innkeeper. He's simply telling us the fact that they showed up probably to Joseph's family home or some relative a little bit late. There is a census going on, and everybody who's kin to Joseph has got to come to the same place. Chances are some of your kids will sleep on air mattresses at Grandma and Grandpa's house this Christmas, right? It's one of those kind of scenes. It's like everybody's home. This isn't holidays. But we got to figure out where to stick people. And you can curl up in the corner and there's some blankets in the closet and pull those out and blow up the air mattress and all that kind of thing. And there's no room in the guest room. So we'll make do. This contrast between King Jesus and Caesar Augustus couldn't be more different. A manger? That's the sign? The Savior of the world has been born, shepherds, unto you. I mean, just let this sink in. When we're talking about the danger of familiarity, the Savior of the world has been born. He is the anointed one, the Messiah, the Lord. You will find him in a feeding trough. That's weird. It's counterintuitive. It's strange. It's peculiar. It's unlikely. It's atypical. I'm running out of adjectives here. Savior of the world, infinite in glory, feeding trough. What is happening here? What is Jesus revealing about the nature of God? I mean, Roman Empire, right? They got gods all over the place over there. They have a pantheon of gods. That means lots of gods. You wouldn't catch Zeus's children being laid in a feeding trough. You wouldn't catch Athena putting a god in a feeding trough. You wouldn't catch any of them doing anything like that. And yet Luke says, the God of Israel is at work. The Savior has come, the descendant of David. Caesar wishes he had a lineage running back as long as David. Jesus' royal line is far more ancient than anything the Roman Empire could dream up. The sign will be a manger. Well, what does the sign signify? Doesn't it signify that the God revealed in Jesus takes a posture of lowliness? Doesn't it signify that the God revealed in the flesh of Jesus is humble?